Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn, and today we're diving into one of the most haunting disappearances in recent memory. In December 2009, Susan Powell vanished from her Utah home without a trace. Her husband Josh claimed he took their 2 young sons camping in a snowstorm at midnight. When they returned, Susan was gone, leaving behind her purse, phone, and all personal belongings. What followed was a web of disturbing behavior, red flags that had been present for years, and ultimately an unimaginable tragedy that would claim more lives than just Susan's. Her own chilling words, "If I die, it may not be an accident, even if it looks like one," would prove prophetic. Join me as we examine the evidence, the warning signs everyone missed, and the devastating aftermath of the Susan Powell case. On the morning of December 7th, 2009, Susan Powell didn't show up for work. She didn't drop her 2 young boys off at daycare. She simply vanished from her home in West Valley City, Utah, leaving behind her purse, her cell phone, and all of her personal belongings. The only people who might have known what happened to her were her husband, Josh Powell, and their 2 sons, 4-year-old Charlie and 2-year-old Braden. When police arrived at the Powell home that day, Josh had a story ready. He claimed he had taken his boys camping in the middle of the night during a snowstorm. When they returned, Susan was gone. It was a story that didn't add up from the beginning, one that would set off a cascade of disturbing revelations, suspicious behavior, and ultimately, unimaginable tragedy. The disappearance of Susan Powell is not just a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. It's a case that exposes the limitations of the justice system, the devastating impact of domestic abuse, and the heartbreaking consequences when red flags go unheeded. Susan Cox was born on October 16, 1981, in Alamogordo, New Mexico, to Chuck and Judy Cox. Friends and family described her as vivacious, organized, and deeply devoted to her children. She met Josh Powell at a singles ward of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints when she was 19. They married in the Portland, Oregon temple in April 2001. From the outside, the Powells appeared to be a normal young family. Susan worked as a cosmetologist before taking a job at Wells Fargo. Josh worked various jobs, though he struggled with employment, and the family's finances were often strained. By most accounts, Susan was the stable provider, the one who kept the household running. But behind closed doors, there were serious problems. Friends later reported that Josh was controlling and emotionally abusive. He criticized Susan constantly, monitored her spending, and kept her on a tight budget while spending freely himself. Susan confided in friends and wrote in personal emails that she was unhappy in her marriage and feared Josh might harm her. In July 2008, Susan recorded a video in a closet of their home, documenting valuables and expressing fear for her safety. "If I die, it may not be an accident, even if it looks like one," she said on the recording. She also wrote a letter and sealed it in a safe deposit box, with the instruction that it should not be shown to Josh if something happened to her. These were not the only warning signs. Friends reported that Josh had become increasingly controlling and possessive. Susan had told several people that if she ever disappeared, they should not believe it was an accident. By 2009, Susan was making plans to leave Josh. She had confided in friends and family that she was preparing to divorce him and was saving money to do so. She had even spoken with a divorce attorney. But before she could leave, Susan disappeared. The events of December 6th and 7th, 2009 have been scrutinized endlessly by investigators, family members, and true crime enthusiasts. Here's what we know. On Sunday, December 6th, a neighbor came over for lunch after church. She reported that Susan seemed normal that day. Josh made pancakes for everyone. The neighbor left around 5 p.m. making her the last person outside the Powell family known to have seen Susan alive. According to Josh's later account, he decided to take his sons camping at around midnight, despite the heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures. He claimed he wanted to try out a new generator in the desert of the Pony Express Trail, about 80 miles southwest of their home. He said when he returned home around 5 p.m. the next day, Susan was gone. When Susan didn't show up for work on Monday morning, her colleagues became concerned. Josh didn't answer phone calls from the daycare where the boys were supposed to be dropped off. Eventually, concerned friends and family members went to the Powell home. Finding no one there, they contacted the police. When Josh finally returned home with the boys, he told police about the impromptu camping trip. Officers noted that the story seemed implausible, given the weather conditions and the late hour. They also observed that Josh showed little concern about his wife's whereabouts. A detective asked to take Josh to the police station for questioning. During the interview, Josh's behavior raised red flags. He seemed detached and unconcerned. He answered questions vaguely and focused on trivial details rather than helping to locate his missing wife. While Josh was being questioned, investigators searched the Powell home. They found 2 box fans positioned to blow on a sofa, which appeared to have been recently cleaned. They also noted that Susan's purse, keys, and cell phone were still in the house. Her wallet was in her purse, with all her credit cards and identification intact. Josh's story about the camping trip couldn't be verified. When asked where specifically he had gone camping, he gave vague answers, saying he wasn't sure because it was dark. Police took him and the boys to demonstrate where they had been, but the story kept changing. No evidence of camping was found at any of the locations Josh pointed out. The day after Susan's disappearance, police obtained warrants to search the Powell home and vehicles more thoroughly. They discovered Susan's blood on the floor near a sofa. Josh had also taken out a large life insurance policy on Susan, and just 2 weeks before her disappearance, she had written a letter saying if she died, it may not be an accident, even if it looks like one. As the investigation continued, more troubling information emerged. Josh had cleaned out Susan's retirement accounts within days of her disappearance. He also immediately cancelled her upcoming chiropractic appointments and other scheduled events. 10 days after Susan vanished, Josh rented a car and put over 800 miles on it, driving in a direction away from where he claimed to have gone camping. Investigators later found Susan's blood in the car, but by then, crucial evidence had been lost. Josh's father, Stephen Powell, with whom Josh and the children moved in after Susan's disappearance, made disturbing statements to the media, suggesting that Susan had run away with another man. He later claimed that he and Susan had been in love and had a sexual relationship, allegations that were vehemently denied by Susan's friends and family and contradicted by Susan's own writings. The investigation revealed that Stephen Powell had a disturbing obsession with his daughter-in-law. He had secretly taken thousands of photos and videos of Susan without her knowledge, many focusing on her body. He had also written explicit journal entries about her. Susan had told friends that Stephen made her uncomfortable and that she didn't want her children around him. As weeks turned into months, Josh Powell stopped cooperating with police. He hired an attorney and refused to answer questions about Susan's disappearance. He moved with his sons to Puyallup, Washington, to live with his father, effectively removing himself from the center of the investigation in Utah. In August 2011, police searched Stephen Powell's home in Washington. They were looking for evidence related to Susan's disappearance, but instead found evidence of voyeurism and child pornography. Stephen was arrested and eventually convicted on 14 counts of voyeurism for taking photographs of 2 neighbor girls, aged 8 and 10. Following Stephen's arrest, Josh lost custody of his sons. Charlie and Braden were placed with Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox. During supervised visits, the boys began to make concerning statements. Charlie told his grandparents and a social worker that Mommy was in the trunk during the camping trip. He said they had gone camping, but his mother had been in the trunk and did not come back with them. Josh was ordered to undergo a psychosexual evaluation and polygraph test as part of his attempt to regain custody of his children. Instead, on February 5, 2012, during a supervised visit at his rented home, Josh locked the social worker out of the house. The worker called 911, reporting that she smelled gasoline. Before emergency responders could arrive, Josh attacked his sons with a hatchet and then set off an explosion that killed all three of them. The murder-suicide of Josh Powell and his sons sent shockwaves through the community and devastated Susan's family, who had already endured so much. It also effectively ended any hope of learning from Josh what had happened to Susan. In the aftermath, investigators continued to piece together what might have happened on that December night in 2009. They focused on Josh's brother, Michael Powell, who had been staunchly supportive of Josh and critical of the police investigation. Cell phone records showed that Michael's phone had been turned off for 12 hours the day after Susan disappeared. He had also driven his car to a salvage yard and abandoned it just 2 weeks after Susan vanished. When police eventually found and searched the car, cadaver dogs indicated the presence of human decomposition. Investigators theorized that Michael might have helped Josh dispose of Susan's body. However, before they could question him further, Michael died by suicide in February 2013, jumping from a parking garage in Minneapolis. With the deaths of Josh and Michael Powell, many of the answers about what happened to Susan may have died with them. However, the investigation has never been officially closed. In May 2013, West Valley City Police announced they had concluded their active investigation into Susan's disappearance. They stated that they believed Josh Powell was responsible for his wife's death, and they also believed his brother Michael had helped him dispose of Susan's body. However, without Susan's remains or direct evidence of her murder, they couldn't make an official declaration. Chuck and Judy Cox, Susan's parents, have never given up hope of finding their daughter and laying her to rest. They have continued to search for her remains and to keep her story in the public eye. The case has had lasting impacts on laws and procedures in both Utah and Washington. In Washington, a law was passed known as Charlie and Braden's Law, which prohibits a person under investigation for a serious crime from having supervised visits with their children in their own home. The Susan Powell case also highlighted the challenges of prosecuting domestic violence cases and the importance of taking threats and warning signs seriously. Susan had documented her fears and concerns, but the system wasn't able to protect her before it was too late. In the years since Susan's disappearance, numerous searches have been conducted in the desert areas of Utah and Nevada, based on tips and theories about where Josh might have hidden her body. Despite these efforts, Susan has never been found. One of the most extensive searches occurred in 2019, when investigators searched a network of abandoned mines near Ely, Nevada. The search was prompted by information that Josh had shown interest in the area and had made comments about how mines would be a good place to hide a body. Despite a thorough search, no evidence of Susan was found. The investigation into Susan's disappearance also uncovered disturbing information about the Powell family dynamics. Stephen Powell's journals and the testimony of family members painted a picture of a household with troubling attitudes toward women and inappropriate boundaries. Josh's sister, Jennifer Graves, broke with her family to support the investigation and the Cox family. She has spoken publicly about her belief that her brother killed Susan and about the dysfunctional aspects of their family life growing up. The Cox family has worked tirelessly to keep Susan's memory alive and to advocate for changes in how domestic violence and missing persons cases are handled. They established the Susan Cox Powell Foundation to raise awareness about domestic violence and to help families of missing persons. In a heartbreaking twist, Susan's father, Chuck Cox, revealed in interviews that he had once cautioned his daughter about Josh, sensing something was off about him. Susan had reassured her father that Josh would never hurt her. This is a reminder of how even those closest to victims of domestic violence may not fully comprehend the danger until it's too late. The Susan Powell case has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and podcasts, each attempting to piece together what happened and to understand the warning signs that were missed. It serves as a sobering reminder of the devastating consequences of domestic violence and the importance of taking threats and concerns seriously. Despite the passage of time, the case continues to resonate with the public and with law enforcement. West Valley City Police have stated that they would reopen the active investigation if new evidence were to emerge, particularly if Susan's remains were found. For now, the disappearance of Susan Powell remains officially unsolved, though investigators, family members, and most who have followed the case believe that Josh Powell was responsible for her death. The lack of closure continues to haunt those who loved Susan and those who have worked to solve the mystery of what happened to her on that cold December night in 2009. The story of Susan Powell is not just a true crime mystery. It's a tragedy that might have been prevented had the warning signs been recognized and acted upon. It's a case that continues to raise important questions about how society responds to domestic violence and about the limitations of a legal system that requires evidence that, in some cases, may have been deliberately and effectively concealed. As we reflect on this case, it's important to remember Susan not just as a victim, but as a person. A mother who loved her children, a daughter cherished by her parents, a friend remembered fondly by those who knew her. In the words of her father, Chuck Cox, "We just want to find Susan and bring her home." The search for Susan continues, as does the hope that someday the full truth of what happened to her will be known and she can finally be laid to rest. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Susan Powell case is how many people recognized the danger she was in, yet were unable to prevent the tragedy that unfolded. Susan herself was aware of the risk. In addition to the video she recorded and the letter she left in a safe deposit box, she had told friends, "If I die, it may not be an accident." Kiersey Hellawell, one of Susan's closest friends, later revealed that Susan had given her a handwritten letter in June 2008, which stated that if anything happened to her, especially if it looks like an accident, please don't give up. The letter included a list of people who should be questioned, with Josh's name at the top. Susan's daycare provider, Debbie Caldwell, reported that in the summer of 2008, Susan had told her, "If something happens to me or my boys, Josh did it." These warnings were not vague feelings of unease. They were specific fears based on Josh's behavior. Friends reported that Josh would sometimes say disturbing things, like wondering aloud how to dispose of a body so it would never be found. He had also made comments about how easy it would be to hide a body in one of the abandoned mines in the desert. Josh's controlling behavior extended beyond finances. He dictated what Susan could wear, monitored her communications, and isolated her from friends and family. He was known to check the odometer on her car to track her movements and would become angry if she deviated from her expected routine. The financial control was particularly severe. Despite Susan being the primary breadwinner, Josh gave her a meager allowance and closely scrutinized her spending. Meanwhile, he spent freely on himself, accumulating debt and making poor financial decisions that frustrated Susan. By 2009, the marriage had deteriorated significantly. Susan had confided in friends that she was planning to leave Josh and was saving money for a divorce. She had consulted with a divorce attorney and had begun documenting Josh's behavior for potential custody proceedings. According to friends, Susan had set a timeline for herself. If things didn't improve by their wedding anniversary in April 2010, she planned to file for divorce. She never got the chance. The investigation into Susan's disappearance was complicated by several factors. Josh's story about the midnight camping trip was implausible, but difficult to disprove conclusively. The weather on the night of December 6th to 7th, 2009 was indeed severe, with temperatures below freezing and heavy snowfall. The idea that anyone would take 2 young children camping in such conditions strained credibility. When police asked Josh to show them where he had gone camping, he was vague and evasive. He claimed he couldn't remember exactly where they had gone because it was dark. He pointed out several possible locations, but searches of these areas found no evidence of recent camping activity. The timeline Josh provided also raised questions. He claimed to have left home around midnight and returned around 5 p.m. the next day. This would mean he and the boys were outdoors in freezing conditions for approximately 17 hours. Yet when they returned home, they did not appear to be suffering from exposure to the cold, and the camping equipment didn't look like it had been used in snow. Josh's behavior after Susan's disappearance was equally suspicious. Within days, he had withdrawn money from her retirement accounts. He cancelled her upcoming appointments and seemed more concerned with practicalities than with finding his missing wife. When asked by police if he had any ideas about where Susan might be, Josh suggested she might have run away with another man. He pointed to a supposed emotional affair Susan had with a co-worker, though friends and family said no such affair existed. The police investigation faced significant challenges. Without a body or a crime scene, building a case against Josh was difficult. The evidence they did have, the blood on the sofa, the fans positioned to dry the sofa, Josh's implausible story, and his suspicious behavior, was circumstantial. Investigators were also hampered by Josh's quick relocation to Washington State, which put him outside their jurisdiction. The move to his father's home also meant that the children were now living in a household with Stephen Powell, whose obsession with Susan was deeply troubling. Stephen Powell's role in the case added another layer of complexity. After Susan's disappearance, he made bizarre and unsubstantiated claims to the media, suggesting that Susan had been sexually involved with him and that she had run away. He released pages from what he claimed were Susan's diaries, though these were later determined to be forgeries. The search of Stephen Powell's home in August 2011, which led to his arrest on voyeurism and child pornography charges, revealed the extent of his disturbing behavior. Investigators found thousands of images of Susan taken without her knowledge, as well as journal entries detailing his sexual obsession with her. This discovery led to Josh losing custody of Charlie and Braden, who were placed with Susan's parents. It was during this time that Charlie began making statements about his mother being in the trunk during the camping trip. The supervised visits between Josh and his sons were fraught with tension. Josh was living in a rented home in Graham, Washington, and was fighting to regain custody. The social workers who supervised these visits reported that Josh often seemed more interested in extracting information from the boys about where they were living with their grandparents than in spending quality time with them. The events of February 5th, 2012, when Josh murdered Charlie and Braden and took his own life, sent shockwaves through everyone involved in the case. The social worker who had brought the boys for their visit that day, Elizabeth Griffin Hall, later described her horror at being locked out of the house and her desperate 911 call as she smelled gasoline and feared for the children's lives. The 911 response to Griffin Hall's call has been criticized for its delay and for the dispatcher's apparent lack of urgency. By the time emergency responders arrived at the house, it was engulfed in flames. Investigators later determined that Josh had planned the murder-suicide meticulously. He had withdrawn large sums of money, donated his son's toys to Goodwill, and sent goodbye emails to some people. He had also purchased several gallons of gasoline. Autopsies revealed that Josh had attacked the boys with a hatchet before setting off the explosion. This horrific act of violence against his own children stunned even those who had long suspected him of harming Susan. The focus of the investigation then shifted to Josh's brother, Michael Powell. Cell phone records showed that Michael's phone had been turned off for 12 hours the day after Susan disappeared, which was unusual for him. He had also abandoned his car at a salvage yard just 2 weeks after Susan vanished. When police eventually located and searched the car, cadaver dogs indicated the presence of human decomposition. However, without more concrete evidence, they couldn't determine if the car had been used to transport Susan's body. Michael had been one of Josh's staunchest defenders, often criticizing the police investigation and maintaining his brother's innocence. He had also helped Josh financially after Susan's disappearance. The theory developed by investigators was that Josh had killed Susan, possibly after she threatened to leave him or during an argument, and that Michael had helped him dispose of her body. They believed that Josh may have initially hidden Susan's body in the trunk of the minivan during the camping trip with his sons, which would explain Charlie's later statements. Michael Powell's suicide in February 2013, just over a year after Josh and the boys died, added another tragic chapter to the story. He jumped from the roof of a parking garage in Minneapolis, where he had been living and working. He left a suicide note, but its contents have not been made public. With the deaths of Josh and Michael, many of the answers about what happened to Susan may never be known. However, the investigation has pieced together a timeline and theory that is widely accepted by those familiar with the case. Investigators believe that something happened between Susan and Josh on the evening of December 6, 2009, after their neighbor left. They think Josh killed Susan in the home, which would explain the blood found on the sofa and the fans positioned to dry it. They believe he then loaded her body into the minivan, possibly in the trunk, and took the boys on the purported camping trip as a cover story. During this time, they theorize Josh disposed of Susan's body, possibly in one of the abandoned mines he had shown interest in. The vast, remote desert areas of western Utah and eastern Nevada offer countless places where a body could be hidden and never found. The theory suggests that Michael Powell may have met Josh somewhere during this time to help dispose of the body or the evidence, which would explain his phone being turned off and the later abandonment of his car. Despite extensive searches of mines, caves, and desert areas, Susan's remains have never been found. The harsh environment and vast expanses of wilderness make the search incredibly challenging. The Cox family has continued to advocate for Susan and to keep her case in the public eye. They established the Susan Cox Powell Foundation to raise awareness about domestic violence and to help families of missing persons. They have also fought legal battles over life insurance policies and other financial matters related to Susan and the boys. In a cruel twist, Josh had changed his life insurance policy to name his brother Michael as the beneficiary, cutting out his sons. After Josh's death, Michael tried to claim the $1.5 million insurance payout, which led to a legal battle with the Cox family. After Michael's suicide, the courts ultimately ruled that the money should go to a trust for Charlie and Braden, which, since they were deceased, effectively went to the Cox family. The Susan Powell case has had lasting impacts on laws and procedures related to domestic violence and child protection. In Washington state, Charlie and Braden's law was passed to prohibit supervised visits in the homes of parents who are under investigation for serious crimes. The case has also led to discussions about how the legal system handles domestic violence cases, particularly when the victim is missing and presumed dead, but no body has been found. It raises questions about what constitutes sufficient evidence to charge someone with murder in the absence of a body. For those who have followed the case closely, One of the most frustrating aspects is the feeling that more could have been done to protect Susan, and later, Charlie and Braden. The warning signs were there. Susan's explicit fears, Josh's controlling behavior, the documented threats, yet the system wasn't able to intervene effectively. The case of Susan Powell also highlights the challenges faced by law enforcement when building a case without a body. West Valley City Police were convinced Josh was responsible for Susan's disappearance, but without her remains or a clear crime scene, they struggled to gather enough evidence to make an arrest. This created a tragic limbo where Josh remained free despite being the prime suspect. After Susan's disappearance, investigators discovered more about Josh's disturbing behavior in the weeks leading up to that December night. Computer forensics revealed that Josh had conducted internet searches about how bodies decompose in different environments and how to dispose of someone without leaving evidence. These searches dated back months before Susan vanished, suggesting premeditation. Friends later revealed that Josh had made comments about the remote desert mines being a good place to hide a body because they're so deep they'd never find it. He had shown an unusual interest in these abandoned mines, even taking the family on drives to areas where they were located. The investigation also uncovered financial motives. Susan had a life insurance policy worth $1.5 million, and the family was struggling financially due largely to Josh's poor money management. Bank records showed that Josh had withdrawn large sums from their accounts in the days before Susan disappeared. In one particularly telling incident about a year before she vanished, Susan had called the police during an argument with Josh. She told officers that Josh had refused to let her use a shared vehicle to go to a planned family function. When police arrived, the situation had calmed and no arrest was made. This incident, while seemingly minor, demonstrated the control dynamics in their relationship. Susan's journals, which investigators obtained after her disappearance, painted a picture of a deteriorating marriage. She wrote about Josh's emotional abuse, his controlling behavior, and her growing fear. In one entry from 2008, she wrote, "If I die, it may not be an accident, even if it looks like one." She also detailed specific incidents that had frightened her, including times when Josh had become enraged over small issues. The journals also revealed Susan's internal conflict. Like many victims of domestic abuse, she went back and forth between recognizing the danger of her situation and trying to make the marriage work for the sake of her children. She wrote about her religious beliefs and her desire to honor her marriage vows, even as she acknowledged that the relationship had become toxic. What makes the Susan Powell case particularly heartbreaking is how many people knew she was in danger. In addition to her friends and family, there were professionals who had concerns. Susan's therapist later revealed that she had discussed safety planning with Susan due to concerns about Josh's behavior. Susan's co-workers at Wells Fargo had noticed concerning dynamics when Josh would visit her at work, describing him as controlling and Susan as appearing anxious in his presence. After Susan disappeared, investigators learned more about Josh's family background, which provided context for his behavior. Josh's parents had gone through a bitter divorce when he was young. His mother, Tarika Powell, had obtained a restraining order against his father, Stephen Powell, citing abusive behavior. Josh had primarily lived with his father after the divorce, which may have shaped his attitudes toward women and relationships. The relationship between Josh and his father Stephen was deeply troubling. After Susan's disappearance, when Josh moved with the boys to Stephen's home in Washington, the living situation became increasingly concerning. Stephen not only defended Josh publicly, but made disturbing claims about Susan, including publishing what he claimed were her diaries, later proven to be forgeries, that suggested she was sexually promiscuous and unhappy in her marriage. The search of Stephen Powell's home in August 2011 revealed thousands of images of women and girls taken without their knowledge, including many of Susan. Investigators found videos Stephen had secretly recorded of Susan, often focusing on intimate parts of her body, as well as journal entries detailing his sexual fantasies about her. This discovery led to Stephen's arrest and conviction on voyeurism charges. The custody battle that followed was another painful chapter in this tragic story. After Josh lost custody of Charlie and Braden due to the unsafe environment in Stephen's home, the boys were placed with Chuck and Judy Cox, Susan's parents. During supervised visits with their father, the boys began to share concerning information. According to court documents and statements from the Cox family, Charlie, the older boy, told his grandparents that Mommy was in the trunk during the camping trip. He said they had gone camping, but his mother had been in the trunk and did not come back with them. He also made a drawing that showed the minivan with Mommy in the trunk. Child psychologists who interviewed the boys noted that they showed signs of trauma. Braden, who had been only 2 at the time of his mother's disappearance, had nightmares and behavioral issues. Charlie, who had been 4, had more specific memories and seemed to understand more about what had happened, though he struggled to articulate it fully given his young age. The supervised visits between Josh and his sons were tense. Reports from social workers indicated that Josh often seemed more interested in finding out where the boys were living and what they were telling others than in engaging with them as a father. He would bring them toys and treats, but showed little emotional connection. As part of the custody case, Josh was ordered to undergo a psychosexual evaluation after investigators found concerning images on his computer. Rather than comply with this order, which might have revealed more about his psychological state and potential danger to the children, Josh planned and executed the murder-suicide that claimed his and his sons' lives. The 911 call from the social worker, Elizabeth Griffin Hall, on February 5, 2012, is heart-wrenching. She described being locked out of Josh's house after he grabbed the boys and pulled them inside. She told the dispatcher she could smell gasoline and feared for the children's safety. The dispatcher's response has been criticized for not conveying the urgency of the situation to first responders. When firefighters finally arrived at the house, it was engulfed in flames. The autopsies later revealed that Josh had attacked Charlie and Braden with a hatchet before setting off the explosion, inflicting wounds that would have been fatal even without the fire. This level of violence against his own children shocked even those who had long suspected him of harming Susan. In the aftermath of this tragedy, attention turned to Josh's brother, Michael Powell. Investigators had been looking into Michael's potential involvement in Susan's disappearance for some time. Cell phone records showed that Michael's phone had been turned off for 12 hours the day after Susan disappeared, which was unusual for him. He had also made several calls to Josh during the critical period when Susan went missing. Perhaps most suspiciously, Michael had abandoned his car at a salvage yard just 2 weeks after Susan vanished. When police eventually located and searched the car in 2012, cadaver dogs indicated the presence of human decomposition in the trunk. However, without more concrete evidence, they couldn't determine if the car had been used to transport Susan's body. Michael had been one of Josh's staunchest defenders, often criticizing the police investigation and maintaining his brother's innocence. He had also helped Josh financially after Susan's disappearance. He ran a website defending Josh and questioning the police investigation, suggesting alternative theories about Susan's disappearance. After Josh's death, Michael became embroiled in a legal battle over Josh's life insurance policy. Josh had named Michael as the beneficiary of his $1.5 million policy, cutting out his sons. The Cox family challenged this in court, arguing that Josh should not benefit from his crimes and that the money should go to a trust for the boys, which, since they were deceased, would effectively go to the Cox family as their guardians. As this legal battle was ongoing, and as investigators were focusing more on Michael's potential role in Susan's disappearance, Michael died by suicide in February 2013. He jumped from the roof of a parking garage in Minneapolis, where he had been living and working. He left a suicide note, but its contents have not been made public. With the deaths of Josh and Michael Powell, many of the answers about what happened to Susan may never be known. However, based on the evidence gathered over years of investigation, law enforcement has developed a theory that is widely accepted by those familiar with the case. Investigators believe that something happened between Susan and Josh on the evening of December 6, 2009, after their neighbor left. They think Josh killed Susan in the home, which would explain the blood found on the sofa and the fans positioned to dry it. They believe he then loaded her body into the minivan, possibly in the trunk, and took the boys on the purported camping trip as a cover story. During this time, they theorize Josh disposed of Susan's body, possibly in one of the abandoned mines he had shown interest in. The vast, remote desert areas of western Utah and eastern Nevada offer countless places where a body could be hidden and never found. The theory suggests that Michael Powell may have met Josh somewhere during this time to help dispose of the body or the evidence, which would explain his phone being turned off and the later abandonment of his car. Despite numerous searches over the years, Susan's remains have never been found. The harsh desert environment, with its extreme temperatures and rugged terrain, makes the search incredibly challenging. Additionally, if Josh did hide Susan's body in an abandoned mine, as many suspect, the depth and dangerous conditions of these mines make thorough searches nearly impossible. In May 2013, West Valley City Police announced that they had concluded their active investigation into Susan's disappearance. They stated publicly for the first time that they believed Josh Powell was responsible for his wife's death, and that they also believed his brother Michael had helped him dispose of Susan's body. However, without Susan's remains or direct evidence of her murder, they couldn't make an official declaration closing the case. The Cox family has never given up hope of finding Susan. Chuck and Judy Cox have continued to search for their daughter, working with private investigators and volunteers to explore areas where Susan might be hidden. They have also fought legal battles over life insurance policies and other financial matters related to Susan and the boys. In a particularly cruel twist, after Josh's death, it was discovered that he had changed his will just days before killing himself and the boys. The new will excluded the Cox family from any inheritance and directed that Josh's remains be cremated without a funeral service. It also specified that Charlie and Braden should be buried in a single casket, away from any cemetery where Susan might eventually be laid to rest. The courts ultimately intervened, allowing the Cox family to bury Charlie and Braden together in a cemetery in Puyallup, Washington, where a plot has been reserved for Susan if her remains are ever found. The boys' headstone includes an angel figure representing their mother watching over them. The legal battles continued even after the deaths of Josh, Charlie, and Braden. The dispute over Josh's life insurance policy was resolved in 2015, with the courts ruling that the money should go to a trust for Charlie and Braden, which effectively went to the Cox family since the boys were deceased. There was also a wrongful death lawsuit filed by the Cox family against the Washington Department of Social and Health Services, alleging that the agency had been negligent in allowing Josh to have supervised visits with the boys in his own home. This case was settled in 2019 for $98 million, one of the largest settlements of its kind in Washington state history. The Susan Powell Foundation, established by the Cox family, continues to raise awareness about domestic violence and to help families of missing persons. They have worked to change laws and procedures to better protect victims of domestic abuse and children in custody disputes. The case has had lasting impacts on laws and procedures in both Utah and Washington. In Washington, Charlie and Braden's law was passed, prohibiting parents who are under investigation for serious crimes from having supervised visits with their children in their own homes. The law also requires more thorough background checks for individuals involved in custody cases. In Utah, the case led to discussions about how police handle missing persons cases, particularly when domestic violence is suspected. It raised questions about what constitutes sufficient evidence to charge someone with murder in the absence of a body, and about how to better identify and respond to warning signs of domestic abuse. For those who have followed the case closely, one of the most frustrating aspects is the feeling that more could have been done to protect Susan, and later Charlie and Braden. The warning signs were there: Susan's explicit fears, Josh's controlling behavior, the documented threats, yet the system wasn't able to intervene effectively. The case also highlights the challenges faced by victims of domestic abuse who are trying to leave dangerous relationships. Susan was taking steps to leave Josh, but like many victims, she faced financial constraints and fears about losing custody of her children. She was caught in the most dangerous period for victims of domestic violence, the time when they are actively trying to leave their abusers. Susan's story has been told in numerous books, documentaries, and podcasts, each attempting to piece together what happened and to understand the warning signs that were missed. The 2019 documentary, The Disappearance of Susan Cox Powell, and the podcast Cold, both provided in-depth examinations of the case, including previously unreleased information and interviews with key figures. These retellings serve not only to keep Susan's memory alive, but also to educate the public about the realities of domestic violence and the importance of recognizing warning signs. They emphasize that domestic abuse occurs across all socioeconomic levels and within all communities, including religious ones. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, of which both Susan and Josh were members, has faced questions about how it handles domestic abuse within its congregations. Some have suggested that the Church's emphasis on marriage and family preservation may sometimes inadvertently discourage victims from leaving abusive situations. However, others point out that the Church has resources for abuse victims, and that individual leaders often do provide support to those in danger. As time passes, the chances of finding Susan's remains diminish, but the Cox family and dedicated investigators have not given up hope. Advances in technology and new information could still lead to a breakthrough in the case. In recent years, there have been several renewed search efforts based on tips and new analyses of existing evidence. In 2018, a search was conducted in a remote area near Topaz Mountain in Utah, after a review of Josh's computer records showed interest in the area. In 2019, another search focused on a network of abandoned mines near Ely, Nevada. While these searches have not yet yielded Susan's remains, they demonstrate the ongoing commitment to finding her and providing closure for her family. The West Valley City Police Department has stated that they would reopen the active investigation if new evidence were to emerge, particularly if Susan's remains were found. The legacy of the Susan Powell case extends beyond the tragedy itself. It has become a powerful example used in training for law enforcement, social workers, and domestic violence advocates. It illustrates the importance of recognizing warning signs, taking threats seriously, and understanding the dynamics of controlling relationships. For Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, the pain of losing their daughter and grandsons is compounded by the lack of closure. They have spoken publicly about their determination to find Susan and to ensure that her story continues to raise awareness about domestic violence. In their advocacy work, they emphasize that domestic abuse is not always physical. The controlling behavior, isolation, and emotional abuse that Susan experienced are common tactics used by abusers to maintain power over their victims. These forms of abuse can be precursors to physical violence and should be taken seriously. The Susan Powell case serves as a sobering reminder of the devastating consequences of domestic violence and the importance of intervention before tragedy occurs. It highlights the need for better coordination between law enforcement, social services, and the legal system in responding to cases of suspected abuse. As we reflect on this case, it's important to remember Susan not just as a victim, but as a person, a mother who loved her children, a daughter cherished by her parents, a friend remembered fondly by those who knew her. In the words of her father, Chuck Cox, "We just want to find Susan and bring her home." The search for Susan continues, as does the hope that someday the full truth of what happened to her will be known, and she can finally be laid to rest alongside the sons she loved so dearly. For now, the disappearance of Susan Powell remains officially unsolved, though the evidence strongly points to Josh Powell as the person responsible for her death. The case stands as one of the most heartbreaking and frustrating mysteries in recent American criminal history. A tragedy that might have been prevented had the many warning signs been heeded and had the systems designed to protect victims worked more effectively.